Hello everybody, my name is Jackson and today I'm going to be discussing the age-old question. No, not that one, the other one. If you happen to live under a rock, I'll explain this for you. Many people believe that playing violent video games is a reason that, more specifically, young people become more violent in the real world. I should have probably been a little bit more specific in the intro cut. So this video is basically going to be discussing the debate, but more or less aimed at modern technology. Said technology is virtual reality. But first I'll be looking at a bit of history in regards to the topic and going forward from there. So before I actually start discussing the topic, I just want to quickly mention something first. This debate's what's known as a moral panic, and many people believe that moral panics are all about spreading misinformation. However, a moral panic is a moral disturbance centering on claims that direct interests have been violated. So essentially they are not simply panics media engendered or otherwise that provide false information. The reason this is relevant is because there is a lot of misinformation spread through the media, mostly the social variety, that video games cause real-world violence, and to be fair, these claims aren't entirely unfounded. So as I mentioned earlier, video games get blamed for violence. A lot. And to be totally honest, I can't understand why. I'm just kidding, games can be violent. The thing is, this topic has been discussed for decades by a bunch of really smart people. One of the reasons that this became such a massive topic was due to the Columbine High School massacre of 1999 in the US. Around that time, the amount of research into the effects of violent video games skyrocketed by about 300%. The thing that I would like to quickly mention is that it wasn't just video games that were blamed. There was a lot of discussion relating to violent media as a whole, and some theories about the Matrix, but I'm specifically discussing the video game aspect of it all. The two shooters, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, were known to be fans of the game Doom, which was often described as a murder simulator by non-gamers. You see, the Doom franchise is all about a guy who fights hordes of demons and the undead. With a gun. Or several for that matter. I'm assuming you made the connection here. Well, in a nutshell, there were some Congress hearings that happened and they suggested the cause of the massacre was violent media. A bloke by the name of Craig Anderson, who is a prominent anti-game activist and social psychologist, testified before the US Senate Commerce Committee, saying, even though one cannot reasonably claim that a particular act of violence or that a lifetime of violence was caused exclusively by the perpetrator's exposure to violent entertainment media, one can reasonably claim that such exposure was a contributing causal factor. More importantly for this hearing, my research colleagues are correct in claiming that high exposure to media violence is a major contributing cause in the high rate of violence in modern US society. However, an article written by Batty suggests that the declined crime rate may be tied to the fact that violent video game play occurs in the home environment, putting potential victims of crime out of harm's way. So to sum it up, she states that people playing violent games are less likely to commit similar violent acts in real life, as the game fulfills their desires. She concludes with the idea that violent video games should not be considered a threat to our youth's violent tendencies, but instead could be utilized as a crime reduction tool. But then an interesting question emerges. If a violent game becomes more realistic, does it have a stronger or positive negative effect? And this is where we begin to look at virtual reality gaming as it is described as more realistic, which brings us to our next question. When presented with the question, what makes a game realistic, many people often say the graphics, the world design, the sound. In reality, the best answer would probably be how the game feels. Take Beat Saber for example. The game in terms of graphics and world design is not realistic at all, but if you consider how the sabers effortlessly cut through things like in Star Wars, it becomes realistic. If you were to look at Grand Theft Auto 5 instead, there are certain aspects that feel unrealistic because of the fact that it's set in a world based on reality. Like seriously, you can get shot a ridiculous amount of times while playing, but the second you enter a cutscene, you could probably get murdered by a flippin' mosquito. And don't even get me started on whatever this is meant to be. Also, where does he keep these things? I think you get the point. So I couldn't exactly find a valid source about VR games causing violence, which is why I'm going to be relating it back to what we've previously discussed, while also referring to a new source. So I managed to find a very interesting article by a guy named Jordan Brady Loewen, where he talks about the premise of death in VR. He mentions the significance of dying in VR and how, unlike dying in a standard game, it is theorized that it feels real enough to have an out-of-body experience. He talks about this in regards to 2 VR games, and as it turns out, I just so happen to own one of them. So one of the first things you'll notice is that you don't have arms, but you have hands. This is rather common in VR games, and some people initially think that it would detract from the realism, but sometimes having a body is worse. Loewen himself states, "Though my torso, legs, and arms have no digital manifestation, it still feels like I'm here in this digital world. The tactile responses of my floating digital hands, weighted down by the physical controllers in my material hands outside the game world, are enough to provide a sense of presence in this gamic world." That's essentially a longer way of saying that it feels real, even though he knows that it isn't, kind of like Disneyland, except in the middle of the desert and in a zombie apocalypse. Through the rest of his article, he talks about different studies that have been done in terms of death in virtual reality and how they can affect the mind. Nothing points to you actually feeling like you've died, and there's also nothing that would really suggest that it would give you the feeling of anxiety either. But it is said that it may desensitize people to the concept of death. One of the points that is often brought up in the video games cause real-world violence debate is that it desensitizes people to the violence, therefore they don't necessarily understand the gravity of a situation, or could cause people to respond with violence. So if we look at that argument in terms of what Loewen was saying, a similar idea would apply. Here's a solid example. When I was talking about realism, I mentioned that GTA simulates a real world in which people act somewhat normally. If I were to just shoot someone, it wouldn't feel real, but at the same time, it would desensitize me to the concept of blatantly murdering someone. Now compare that to VR. In one case, I'm right-clicking on a mouse to aim, and then left-clicking to shoot. In the other case, I am gripping the gun, physically raising my hand, and literally pulling a trigger. Do you smell what I'm cooking? See, even in VR, I don't feel like I've brutally murdered my friend because I know that he's fine. The only time where you could physically harm someone is if they so happen to have a haptic suit. Keyword there is physically, because I'm sure killing your friend for no reason could emotionally hurt them in ways that you could not even imagine. At this point in the video, you're probably expecting me to give a flat yes or no to the question at hand. But that's not really what this video is about. Way earlier in the video, I mentioned that the topic is a moral panic, so there's a lot of he said, she said about if video games really do cause real-world violence, especially with the emergence of virtual reality. So instead of giving you a straight answer that doesn't really exist, I've just given you the information to decide for yourself. Personally, for me, I don't see it as that big of an issue for people who are older, as you know what is right and what is wrong. But it does scare me how violent I can become while playing these games. For younger people, I understand wanting to keep them far away from it because it may have a greater effect on them. In the end, it's really up to you. That being said, thank you for watching the video. I hope that I taught you something or helped in any way, and I hope that you enjoyed it.